I am always very turned on when I happen on a city block that's transformed into a set. Trailers buzzing and hairspray spurting out of cans while fake cops and fake pedestrians eat pesto salad and wait for their cue. These moments are my favorite TV moments, when the actor's limbo is also my reality. The city suddenly feels malleable in its own narrative. Tonight is one edit away from being a romance, a slip into a new narrative sublime. For 2 years, we ran a small theater in Berlin. We put on plays by artists, with artists, writers and friends serving as amateur actors, all roughly rehearsed and mostly in English. The space could only hold 60 people a night. We put on around one play a month. While the theater was open, we never shared documentation, and we never really discussed it publicly. We closed the theater last year, and the archive, or at least the storage space, for everything from the theater functions like a budget cryogenic lab, where the backup generators have failed and the bodies are passing from frozen to mush. The cardboard props are wet and the curtains are molding, and we're not sure if we care or if we should contact loved ones to let them know. In some ways, a slow return to life. Back in 2012, just a day or so after Hurricane Sandy hit New York, I sat in one of MoMA's theaters with a crowd of anxious artists and arts administrators as a conservator explained options for the recovery of wet things. I'd been surprised that freezing cryogenics again was an option, particularly for waterlogged books. When it turned time for questions to be answered, the room filled with the excruciating descriptions of material. Ballpoint pen on carbon paper, how to properly hose off an acrylic painting. The crowd gasped at the description of the Martha Graham Dance Company's warehouse, 80 years of costumes soaked in Hudson River water. There was a silence while everyone imagined the futility of trying to save those bobbing garments like long-drowned dancers. Behind the moldy fridges in our Berlin storage are the riggings for the curtains, the pulley system, a wooden structure with metal tubing, the bones of the theater, which could probably be reassembled into some sort of sentimental hell. The flimsy structures of exclusion, front and back, audience and actor, light and dark. In the beginning, we had joked about starting a blog, about the absurdity of the type of language one can generate anonymously and in private, and what it would look like to set up a system to troll in person. Our theater functioned with these structures of exclusion, on recognition, on friends providing content, the reason to stay, the reason to heckle, the reason to feel implicated, or the reason to feel left out. The filter bubbling of the internet makes it nearly impossible for you to see what is both left and right. Social networks' algorithms show you only what they think you want to see, produced by those you want to see it from. Thus, our relationship to narrative is woven by those around us, unwittingly employing structures which get smarter at predicting what will keep us looking. Jesuit Theater began in the mid-1500s and aimed to inspire a devout life. Theater was a major part of the Jesuit school system throughout Europe, and each play was written without narrative at its core, but more with a mood, more like a score for music. The plays were written by priests who culled from shared formulas and Jesuit tropes: God, angels, hell scenes, heavenscapes, magicians, etc. The priests took little credit for the works, as they were merely tasked to making another dish with the same ingredients in the name of Jesuit theater. There were hundreds of plays written each year with no real standouts, no great stories, just repetitive content. Because of this, very few plays survived beyond the description handed out to the audience at the beginning of the show. Obviously a type of propaganda for the church. The plays relied on a firm structure for the wanton development of emotional content, ultimately creating a sort of collective voice that rattled around Europe till the 1700s. This fractured collectivity mirrors the way we consume content via algorithm-derived filter bubbles, where the same parts are being rearranged to give the appearance of narrative or wholeness, but there's no way to see the actual thing, the whole picture, or maybe conflict. In the book Improvisation in the Theater, Keith Johnstone explains that once you decide to ignore content, it becomes possible to understand exactly what narrative is, because you can concentrate on structure. In improv, whatever story emerges on stage is never the point. Rather, it's the system to which the story is built, and the sensitivity to the presence of others to do so. Looking at things in bracketed amounts of characters, or as images in a continuous sequence, we have created a new format for spreading news, a banal collection of daily documents and exchanges. At the same time, with the same resources, we are also watching a golden age of collective writing, the TV shows, the binge-worthy system of narrative. We can watch these narratives in our most intimate spaces at our own pace. Constant pushing and pulling of many voices creates situations that are both harrowingly specific and too general to even make note of. But the algorithms, like Jesuit Theater, are proving to be a stronger system than any story, as they control the mood, the tempo, the pace of how we experience the collective voice of which stories appear and which doesn't, a score outside of our own control. This binging on characters and their feelings places narrative as a stand-in for action. We sometimes feel filled with emotion after consuming hours of drama, and yet are left with inertia, all that feeling with no commitment. Narrative becomes a placator, an emotional catharsis. In this position, I'm left with the question of how do I separate my own emotions from those that are lived out for me? How do I define my content outside of its structures? I'm sure without a strike of a doubt that Facebook and Gmail could send me a list of all the people I've fucked. My own heartbreak has been mediated and tracked, and the words I've generated and time I've spent looking or avoiding the photos that trigger have all been traced. In the early 2000s, Lev Manovich argued that narrative and the database are natural-born enemies. Databases are structures for the collection of data, while narrative is the cause and effect of reading linearly linked data. Algorithms effectively act as the unstable bridge, creating narratives we want to see based on past preferences. In what feels like a post-fact moment, the database can be refreshing. Piles of junk coalesce into narrative, and within these databases, you string together your own truths. You develop your own system of filling in narrative, and suddenly you emerge with your own borderline fanfic. When counter-narratives are algorithmed away from those not in our bubble, what happens to representation? My mother used to tell me that any inanimate object moved by the human hand is a puppet. In the bar, the beer is your puppet. Your phone is a puppet when you're looking for directions, and right now this microphone is my puppet. It goes on. At the theater, we would learn to write for each other's voices because no one was very good at acting. And it became a sort of drag or throwing voice. In this way, we would become each other. There was no hiding ourselves in these moments of testing language, where each other's ideas became fused with the body and the objects around us. Last summer, we led a dance workshop in Vienna with the dancer Angela Schubert. She introduced an exercise called Unconditional Love. In the exercise, you're asked to manifest the feeling of unconditional love towards the first thing you see in the room. You move towards it, stare, caress, move for it, hold it, focus all your energy on it. The aim of the exercise is to manifest both the physicality and emotionality of unconditional love. And after quite some time with this first object, for me a black table with silver base, you are instructed to move on, to let your eyes fall somewhere else, to begin the process anew. The crack in the wall, the speckled linoleum flooring, a silver chair leg. You try to produce the overwhelming, nauseating internal and external feeling of love. Eventually, you are instructed to move through the room with the same feeling, but extending it to every single thing you lay your eyes on, to fall in love unconditionally with the walls, the floor, each other, the negative space and flecks of dirt. Love is a muscle you exercise towards space, towards people, towards objects. In doing this, it felt clear that this capacity for love is only as big as our ability to see it and move towards it or for it. It begged for representation. The feeling of love as a structure of exclusion becomes clear in this. The periphery fades away when focusing, and you value only one thing above all else. Unlike the inaction of passive narrative, love is used as action, a physical state. But the beauty of the exercise is that you also learn to move on. It was crushing to leave the black table with silver base behind, but it was liberating to find that I was able to produce that feeling again and again and again. But back to the bobbing costumes and rotting fridges and all the alienating formats of storage that surround us. How do we navigate the urge to preserve in the face of an endlessly updating present? How do we exercise representation within these marketed cryogenics that both emotionally and physically ask us to move on rapidly to the next with the promise of their own stability to preserve, rendering the structures in use more valuable as we continue with them? How do we break from these structures to allow voice, to flow freely through objects and through each other, and again, to beg for representation? Thank you.